This is, in many ways, a typical reform policy. I mean, anybody listening to that would think, oh, that makes a lot of sense. You know, our prisons are overflowing. But the projections, by the way, is that we're going to need another 10,000 prison places by the end of a decade, and there are no plans to build that. So, of course, why do we roll it out? As Nigel Farage says, we did it with the NHS Nightingale hospitals. Why can't we do it with this? Now, of course, the reason is that it's very hard to build prisons. It's very hard to build anything in Britain. The government actually has really been doing this. It's been doing these sort of these modular extensions to prisons. It's really been doing something like 1,000 places have been added already under a kind of rapid build. But it's difficult to find countries where this works. The Australians managed it in New South Wales. They managed to build a couple of prisons there, and that worked. The Americans tried it once, but other than that, it's a very difficult thing to do.
I'm Carolyn Quinn. It is now 5:35, and Nigel Farage says a reform government would deport every foreign national offender in British jails within months of taking power.
We are organising a trip to El Salvador, and by the way, not all of the prisons, the cages that you've seen on television, and Lee Addison and Vanessa Frake, the former prison governor, they will both be visiting El Salvador soon. To house a foreign national offender in El Salvador will be half the cost of housing a foreign national offender in this country, and will give us more prison spaces.
Well, let's have a look at this pledge. I'm joined in the studio now by Times columnist Fraser Nelson. Fraser, what do you make of this from reform? Is it a deliverable policy?
Well, this is, in many ways, a typical reform policy. I mean, anybody listening to that would think, oh, that makes a lot of sense. You know, our prisons are overflowing. But the projections, by the way, is that we're going to need another 10,000 prison places by the end of a decade, and there are no plans to build that. So, of course, why do we roll it out? As Nigel Farage says, we did it with the NHS Nightingale hospitals. Why can't we do it with this? Now, of course, the reason is that it's very hard to build prisons. It's very hard to build anything in Britain. The government actually has really been doing this. It's been doing these sort of these modular extensions to prisons. It's really been doing something like 1,000 places have been added already under a kind of rapid build. But it's difficult to find countries where this works. The Australians managed it in New South Wales. They managed to build a couple of prisons there, and that worked. The Americans tried it once, but other than that, it's a very difficult thing to do. Where do you put them? How are you going to get planning permission? And to build a prison is one of the highest spec things that you can do.
Yeah, and during the press conference, actually, he was asked, well, what about all the, as you say, the planning objections reform run a lot of councils, don't they? And they are in charge in a lot of the country. So you could have a reform area that objects to a reform national policy. Yeah. Who knows? What about the idea of shipping out foreign national offenders, sticking them in jail places that have been loaned by other countries?
Well, again, this is typical reform. It sounds quite easy. Look, there are too many people in jails. We've got 10,000 foreigners. Why don't we just kick them out to where they came from? What could be easier than that? Well, every country, again, wants to do this. Pretty much populists in every country in Europe says, let's send the foreign prisoners back. The problem is the foreign countries don't usually want to take them. They're quite expensive. And I'll tell you, the real problem we've got, when a prisoner is discharged, a foreign prisoner, they're usually deported. That's it. You've committed a crime. You're a convicted criminal. We don't want you. And so we've got people awaiting deportation. We've now almost got 20,000 convicted criminals awaiting deportation. And we can't do it because the host countries don't want them. And that is really, really difficult. And it's difficult. So unless you're going to, I think, Reform was saying, I think, last week, the idea was you're going to get the Royal Marines to drop people in France, whether they like it or not. Well, unless those Royal Marines are going to do kind of helicopter drops all over Europe, I can't quite see how they're going to get over a problem that the United States has come up against, that pretty much every country in Europe has come up against. What do you do? The countries don't want to take these guys back.
Well, their argument then, and they were making it this morning, is that you then have a third country. So the equivalent of the Rwanda scheme that the Conservatives had. Reform are saying, well, we're going to talk to Kosovo, we're going to talk to El Salvador, and try to get some of these prisoners placed in jails there. Now, the Conservatives say that their Rwanda scheme just floundered on the fact that we were still in the ECHR. And so if we leave the European Convention and reform say the same, that would make it much easier to speed along some of these policies.
No, well, I don't think it would. I mean, it wasn't just the ECHR that got in the way for legal, but I'm a supporter of the Rwanda policy, but it would be naive to think if only you pulled out of Strasbourg you'd be able to do it. There were many other legal obstacles you'd have to get around there. In fact, the Danish actually thought of sending people to Bosnia in prison. That's one of their ideas. And they found that, again, incredibly difficult. And by the way, at the end of this, the Rwandans pulled out of a deal thinking, no, by the way, I'm not quite sure we want all these people to come here. So if this were so easy, it would have been done by governments around the world before. And this is the problem that reform will come up against. Why should people believe that they are somehow going to do what no other government in Europe has managed to do, and it has not been for want of trying?
Well, they hold up Tony Abbott, don't they, in Australia as an example of how it can be tackled. You know, that if you get tough and you just don't brook any dissent, then you just push on through with a policy. Maybe that's what Reform are hoping. And they also hope that they're chiming in with public policy. We've seen a Times survey today, haven't we, indicating that people are more and more distressed by the levels of immigration.
Well, yes, it's rather surprising seeing that, given that immigration is falling quite quickly. If you look at the number of national insurance numbers they've issued to foreigners, it's now at the lowest at something like 20 years. So I think perception has yet to catch up with reality here. Immigration is now something like 80% lower than its peak. Now, maybe that will take a few months to filter through, but that is something which is working. But of course, people do want foreign criminals deported. I mean, who wouldn't? But again, it is the legal obstacles are just so many, and it's difficult to think unless you have an authoritarian government, which in many ways is what reform seems to be proposing, that it will override all of these other safeguards which bind the hands of liberal democracies. I mean, even Trump has found it quite difficult. They mentioned El Salvador because that's what Trump has done, but it just is incredibly legally difficult. Now, there will be a way through this sort of thing, and one of Andy Burnham's tests, of course, well, can he build more prison places? Because he says he wants to stop early release. Well, in that case, he is going to come up with this problem again and again, because if he can't find the places, then he won't have any alternative but to do early release. So this is a huge problem. But if it were to be solved by harsh words and promises of determination, then it would be solved not just in Britain but around the world. I'm just back from Sweden, by the way, where they've started sending people to Estonian prisons. Now, they rented prison spaces there, and it's taken about a couple of years to do it. So you can do these things with negotiation, but it takes time, it takes diplomacy.
And the negotiations or reforms, they are starting now, but yes, it will take time. Thank you so much, Fraser. Thanks for coming in and talking to us about that.